Hallo, niet mijn camera.
I will start speaking in English, which should be quite okay. I believe there's one English speaking person. Hier? Je kan Nederlands praten? Okay. There might be some international audience online, so I'll speak in English. Is that okay for you as well? Yeah. Bobby? Yeah, English is fine. Great. All right. I'm happy that you didn't do French or something as long as you tried that. Sure. Okay, so welcome everybody here at the DEA in Apeldoorn. As most of you know, we here at DEA develop very nice software applications. We do that from a digital DNA, and I think most of the people here in this group have a sense of their own digital DNA, what they like, how they grew up with computers, and probably still use computers to this day. At least I hope. Maybe in a few years we will all be speaking to our digital assistants and we no longer need to touch our computers, but I think that's still a little bit away, but we'll see. So yeah, we're all here, I think, because we love learning, discovering new things, and just be working on these digital things. And we have two talks here for you tonight. Pim will start with his talk. He introduced it with something about ice skating, and I was thinking that like, is this about Frozen or something? What's going to happen? But I think it will be something related to technical development, to Mandarin development, and live coding. Does anyone recognize this ID? It's live. Yes. No guard mode. And after that, Bobby will tell us something about the consistency. And I think, being consistent in your applications is something that's very important. Along that consistency in what you do to the outside world. And I think it's nice to see that this is already the 32nd on the code that we have here at DEA. So speaking of consistency, I think that's very good. And for now, to quickly introduce the program, so we have Pim and Bobby. Between the talks, we have about a 10-minute break to get a quick toilet break, get some drinks. Everybody knows where the fridge is right now, I think. Did anyone not find the beers that they were looking for? Great. All right, then, first give a round of applause for Pim. Yes, correct. Yeah, how was the commute?
Awful.
Awful. All right.
That was nice actually.
When you made your introduction video on LinkedIn, I saw it coming by, and you were sitting in front of an impressive bookcase. And I was wondering if you can recommend one of the books that was in your bookcase, and tell us why.
They're all my wife, so probably
None of them.
No, of course, if obligatory, if there's any book I have to recommend at this point in time, this being a TDD session, it's Chrome Object-Oriented Code Guided Process. Chrome Object-Oriented Software Guided Process. The Goose Book by Steve Freeman.
Okay.
It's been too long since I've read it, but for TDD purposes, definitely one of the best books.
Okay, cool. I'll get the link afterwards to make sure to send it to you. All right, enjoy the talk.
Excellent. Evening, everyone. I'm very honored to be the first speaker at the 10,000 of the Untitled. C# PHP? PHP? Cool. When I first envisioned this session, I thought to do slides with pictures of ice skating and all that kind of stuff to introduce it, but a little bit superfluous. Instead, I'm just gonna ask you, who does code katas? Who has done code katas? A few? Yeah, a couple? Who doesn't know what a code kata is? Excellent. So the goal for this session, yes, we're going to do a little bit of coding, but the primary goal is to get you all to do, well, maybe not tomorrow, but as a regular exercise, do code katas. They help you. What is a code kata? Tonight's session is about the bowling code kata. We'll talk about bowling later, but first katas. Kata comes from Japanese martial arts, and it means a based exercise, based movements. It's like you do in capoeira, where they do like those dances together that are very close to like actual martial arts. The goal is to practice the base movements, get muscle memory. Of course, we have a lot of exercises just from doing our daily work, but getting those exercises from something entirely different than your daily work will actually help you to get The neural paths will help you to get the muscle memory in your fingers of how to approach software development. There are a million code katas out there, but one of the most famous ones is the bowling kata. Has anyone done the bowling kata before? Nice. So for most people, it'll be new. Has anyone done bowling before?
That's a very big trophy. It's a bowling trophy.
Aha. So I'm in the right place.
You can win it.
Nice, the bowling bat. So what are the rules of bowling?
You have to stay outside the line, basically.
That kind of stuff, yes. But I'm talking about scoring mostly. How do you get the trophy?
10 strikes in a row.
Get 300 points, 10 strikes in a row. Yeah, 12, 13, 14, no, 16. Yeah. Bowling. Bowling is a sport where you have 10 pins, one ball, and it's your job to knock all of those pins down. And for every pin that you knock down, you get a point. Unless on 2 rolls, you knock down all 10, which means you get 10 points plus
Double your next round,
the next roll.
next roll, yeah.
Exactly, because if you throw all 10 in one go, which is called a, and then you get a bonus of? Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. Cool. So that's the goal that we have in the bowling kata. The bowling kata is an exercise where you have to score the outcome of a bowling game. Now, there's 2 variants that you can find. One is collecting every single roll as they come in and then giving the score. But the one that we're going to do today is having the game result encoded in a string, where a dash means got your ball, a number means that's the number of pins that you roll, a slash means that's a strike, and an X means that's a slash means it's a spare, and an X means it's a strike. Any questions? Now, I'd like from you tonight, I was asked up front if maybe it would be nice if people would do to code with me. That's probably not the best use of your time, but I definitely want to ask you to be critical on what I'm doing. Yell out if I make a typo, especially as I'm still making it. That's the best way of correcting me. I have a plan in mind, of course, for how this kata is supposed to go. 45 odd minutes is a very short time for an exercise like this, but we'll see how far we come. Your help for me to stay on the path and do the right thing is much appreciated, but I reserve the right to ignore you entirely. There's 2 things before we start coding that we're going to hold ourselves to. The first is we're going to do TV. And the second is we're not going to have duplicate decisions. We'll find that one out when we cross it. Any other questions up front?
I have one very short one. If you're going to go, can you increase the font size slightly, or is it?
In the thingies, it'll be better.
Ah, okay, great.
In the thingamajigs. Any other questions before we start?
Can you do a black?
No.
What was the first thing you said?
The first thing I said, hi. Hi, I'm honored to be here for
the first rule.
the first rule. We're going to do TDD, test-driven development.
Okay.
Who has? Oh, I totally forgot to ask. Who hasn't heard of test-driven development? It's okay if you haven't. Hmm? Now they've heard of it. Yeah, now they've heard of it. Who does it wrong? Everyone. Great. Great. What's the most important rule of test-driven development? Test first. No, that is the rule of test first. What's the difference between test first and test-driven?
Well, I make it test still and then.
I mean, that's test first as well. The point of test-driven means you write enough test code to get a failing test, and then enough production code to get a passing test. And of course, the idea is that the tests are going to help us drive our design. So where do we start? With the test. I have a solution here that is more or less ready for us to start coding in. Let me prove that. I can press the button and then it runs the test. I can also press the shortcut. I'm not necessarily the most experienced MacBook user, so the only thing you can comment on is my use of shortcuts. So I have a bowling test here, and I can't make that read only because that's just how it works. And of course, we're going to extend from test case. I was too late. What would a good first test be? Okay. Probably should be it's more complicated. Much better. So there was, that's just a bit annoying that the message is so far down.
It's not best.
Huh? Yeah.
Best PHP.
Best, oh yes, no. So we're just going to start with expecting that there's a bowling game. And of course, if we do that, that doesn't exist. This says no test executed because we haven't added the annotation to it. And if we then, it says the thingy is not found. Well, we can make that work. We can create this, we can put it in the right space. Get in the source folder, and then we can run it again. And it tells us this test did not perform the assertions, which is the thing that we're waiting for. What's the next thing that we're going to do? Do an assertion. Yeah. On what?
Instance of coding game.
Instance of bowling game. So I will give you a heuristic of mine. I find that in 90% plus of my tests, assert equals is the best one. And if I ever find that I need another one, usually I'm doing something funky. So the first thing that we're going to do is just expect something like this. It's an empty game, and we're just going to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and the bowling game has 10 frames. And of course, that's going to fail because there's no such function. So we're just going to get that one in, make sure that it does what we want it to do. It should return an int. It takes an encoded game, and of course, we can not compile this without actually returning something, and we're back to not any assertions. So far, so good. Any weirdness? What should be the outcome of this game? 0. 0.1. It says an error occurred because I made a typo. What's the nicest thing about TDD is that you're never making too many errors at the same time. Have you ever been in that situation where you've been typing for a while and then run the test and 38 errors in? I hope you see that even on this relatively difficult setup for me to work on, how often I'm running my tests. This isn't for this presentation. When I'm doing TDD, and that's like 40 to 50% of my coding time, this is how I work. Constantly running these tests, every couple of seconds. Not in the order of minutes, in the order of seconds. Of course, this example being somewhat contrived, but yes. Another heuristic that I like to give is the last thing you do and the first thing you do when your hands move away or towards the keyboard is running the test. Because it tells us that we're green, and there's the next thing that we can do. What is the next thing that we can do? Can we do any refactoring? Probably not, right? There's still not that much that we've done so far. So let's add another expectation. What would the next expectation be that we can expect from our system? Yeah, let's call it score point. Score is a point. And let's say that we do something like this. Does that test make sense to you? Excellent.
It's not a good bowler.
Not a very good bowler. Maybe that's the next thing for us to work on. How do we solve this? Has anyone ever heard of the transformation priority premise? That's a Google for you. The transformation priority premise is a little article by Uncle Bob, Mr. Martin, and he states that when you transition from no code to working code, you will follow more or less a similar path. You go from nothing to nil, from nil to constant, from constant to decision, from decision to loop, from loop to whatever. I don't know it exactly by head, but knowing more or less what the next thing is for us to do is very useful. And the more important rule of that is what we'll find for the next test. So what is the decision that we can take here? What should we check?
If and code again contains one.
If it contains one. Let's do this fancy new haystack needle. Yes, thank you. And if it contains one, then
Return one.
return one. Excellent. Was there another decision that we could have done here?
We could have made the whole game. Yeah. A loop.
You could have put on a red nose.
We could have done a loop over.
Yes, but you can't go from constant to loop. Because that set is too big.
Yeah, well then,
You can split the string to characters, and look through the characters and check if there's an integer, and then add it to like a variable.
that's a loop as well, right?
Yeah, you can do those things, but you have to write a test for it first. One of the beautiful things of working this way is your tests verify that your system does what it's supposed to do. So you want to have the tests in place that verify that your code actually does what it's supposed to do. So if you do things like that, if you do things like looping, there is no test here that says we need that. The solution that we have right now is the minimum that we need. And maybe as we start adding more expectations to our system, we'll be forced to get into a more complex implementation. And that is one of the effects of TDD. As your tests get more specific, this situation, that situation, such situation, the other side is that your code gets more generic and it can deal with all of those situations. So what's the next expectation that we could deal with here?
Basically all the other numbers.
How do you know, when it comes to numbers, how do you know what numbers you're using in your tests? There are 6 numbers that you always have to include in your tests, as long as that falls within the spec. Which 6 numbers are they? 0, 1, that's 2.
Upper bound,
Upper bound, what is upper bound?
9 in this case. Or do you need the definition of the upper bound?
Max int.
I guess, yes.
Min int, -1, 0, 1, multiple, and max int. And if those don't fall into the spec, you know from a bowling game, we're not going to be too concerned about validation in this instance. So unless there is a reason to test another number, you don't use other numbers. These are the numbers that you use. Why?
Boundary values.
Yeah. So if there's a reason to use a boundary value, let's say that this game would behave entirely differently as you put 42 in, then of course you would put 42 in because that is indeed a boundary. But you don't test random numbers because that's not sensible. And we'll show that. So we now have an expectation that our system should be able to score more points. So let's run it and let's see what happens. Of course, we can do that. So how do we go and implement this? Another if. The interesting thing about the transformation priority premise is that you can't use the same solution again. So we've already depleted our if, so we can't do that again. So how about we do it like this? So let's say if this is a thingy, then we do this, and elsewise we return the inval of encoding. So instead of applying a loop or anything, we're applying a method, the transformation. Does that make sense to you? So when I asked you earlier, what choices do we have here? I'll do that. What choices do you have here? You have a choice to go for either the one case or the other. And it's important to start thinking, TDD will help you to get to the next stage where you're forced to do it. But it's interesting to think about what's the path that I'm going for here. And how can I make sure that the check that I'm applying actually brings me to the path that I want to be going to? But you don't have to think too hard because, as I've always said in every single presentation that I've ever given, I don't like thinking. Thinking makes me tired. So I like this approach because it forces me to do stuff and I don't have to think about it. All I have to think about is what my tests should be like, and the code doesn't really matter so much because it will follow the tests. What's the next thing that we can do here? What's the next expectation?
2 numbers.
Yeah, that's pretty close. Two numbers I will accept it. One thing that we can do, for example, is this one. Why not?
Well, you already tested that 3 times, right?
Yeah. I mean, we know from the implementation, but we kind of want to write a test that actually forces us to get into the next thing. And we don't need more certainty in this area. We can gain certainty in other ways. I'll show you. You might already see from the source tree what kind of certainty I'm talking about. So the suggestion was 2 numbers. So let's call that scores frame. So we do something like this. Would that be a good test, Bobby?
Yes.
Excellent. How can we make that pass? You don't need to look. See, the interesting thing is we have to recognize what we've done here. This little bit of code does a little bit of parsing for us. And what we can do is we can extract the thing that we're operating on and then reuse it. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take this out and say this is actually an encoded role. We're going to take this piece of code and we're going to call this role. And then we can take this one back and still have the same set of passing tests, a little bit of refactoring in mind. And what we can then do is we can reuse what we've built here. And fix our test. That's what we're doing. We're building out the capacity to handle the situation, and then we're using that capacity to tackle the more complex situations. I'm not saying every time you do TDD, you will run into this instantly. I'm not saying that every problem you're going to solve will be like this, but it's very much the case that when you are tackling software development, what you're doing is you're chunking off little problems at a time, creating solutions for those problems, and then stacking those solutions to build bigger solutions. Maybe there's something cool about the bowling Kata that allows for this kind of stuff. What's the next test? The next frame? Another frame. Scores 2 frames. So let's say you would do something like this. What's that going to be? If you're ever in doubt as you're doing this one, there's a really cool website, bowlinggenius.com. You can verify that the numbers you put in are actually perfect.
And this is that you.
You thought ChatGPT was big, but the Bowling Genius, that is the... How are we going to solve this one? Yeah, do the same thing again. Do the same thing. So when I said you can't do the same thing, I was more or less lying. I just meant that to be convenient for me to shut down your arguments. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this encoded game out, and we're going to say this is actually not an encoded game. What we're talking about here is an encoded frame. Weird. And the encoded frame, that is the thing that we're trying to parse here. So we're just going to take this one out, and we're going to call it frame. That's the one that we're operating on. I don't want to call this class here. I probably should have fixed this. Automated. If you take this one out, how do we make sure that we get only the first part here? Yeah, split by space is possible. Let's just do it. Frames is explode. That's just how
What discount does it do?
Yeah, you tell me. What do you think?
Alright, so split it.
And I made a mistake. What mistake have I made? I actually need this one here. And voila. So we're doing the same thing here. We're building out our capacity, we're expanding on our capacity, we're reusing what we've already built. What's the next thing? The next test. So would 3 be sensible here? Would that lead us to make significantly better code? Or should we just do all of them?
Yeah.
No, let's just do all of them. So I'm going to do something that I can actually count in my head. Oh, that's error. Oh, kost allemaal tijd. 3, 4, 5. Yes. That should be correct. Someone verify quickly. And they should be, hopefully, let's see what happens. And of course, it's only picking up the first 2 frames. We said something about a loop?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, so we could do something like, let's say, score is 0, and then for each frame. Please excuse my typing. I don't do this that often. So you see how building on these capacities enables us to tackle bigger and bigger problems. How's this been so far? Has this been good enough to follow?
Yeah.
Do you see how often I run my tests? Very, very often. I make mistakes. Tiny ones, immediately squashed. Very little thinking. I'm very comfortable, even though I'm standing on the stage and have no clue what to solve the next thing. This is a very comfortable approach. In the presentation I did last year in Utrecht, we talked about heart rate. How do you keep your heart rate as a developer low? How do you keep your worries low? How do you keep your stress level low? This is a very low stress approach. You're always right next to green. If you compare it to like rock climbing, for example, you're always anchored. Click, click, anchor, click, click, anchor, anchor. You commit often, for example, that has the same feeling. You're often committing, it often means that I messed up, git reset, don't care. Cool. Good. So we've written quite a bit of tests. How do we know if these tests are any good? The tests pass. Does that mean the tests are good? Change your code, see if it shows. We can do that. We can go score is 1 and then. Oh, let's go with this one. So every time you want to have confidence, you just change a bit of code and run it. Well, there's actually a really cool tool that does this for you. Oh, that's really good. Has anyone ever heard of infection? Can anyone explain what infection does? You want to?
It changes all the values.
I'll repeat.
Yeah.
Yeah, someone wanted to have dual microphone.
Oh.
That would take the spotlight away from me, and that's not what I want.
It tries all the values to change the values in the code, so you test if your tests are right.
Yeah, exactly. So infection goes into your code, makes changes to your code, runs the tests, and your tests are supposed to fail. And if your tests don't fail, it means a mutant escaped. So let's look at what that is.
What does it change? Constants or everything? Booleans?
Yeah, well, infection, what it literally does is it takes the abstract syntax tree, so it's going to take all the nodes from the tree, and it's going to apply specific changes to those nodes. So it's a, not declarative, but discriminant, no, how do you say that? Same response every time. There's a cool word for it. It does the same thing every time. So it doesn't do random, it doesn't do gambles, whatever. It literally just says, okay, here's a node here, here's a constant with a value of 0. What happens if I do -1? What happens if I do 1? So what it will do is it will give you a log, and it will give you all the code that it could touch without your code, without your test covering that. So here we have 14 mutations that it could generate on our code base. It gave us those mutants, ran the test, and then found that 12 mutants were covered. And the 2 that we have in our log here are the ones that could change, and the test did not cover it. And it's actually a pretty good one. I have here a public method that I could have made protected, and it didn't change anything about the tests, and it's actually the same thing. So let's go in and make those methods private. And we'll rerun infection. And 100% coverage, 100% mutation killing. Does anyone use code coverage as a metric? Stop using code coverage. Use this one. This one's slow because it runs your entire suite for every mutant, but it's far superior to the information that code coverage gives you.
Because if it changes something, that means you don't have it covered. Right?
Exactly. Because if it can change something, it means you don't have it covered. So what's interesting, one of the things that happens when you apply TDD, and this is a common and accurate criticism, is we now build a test suite, but this test suite was like scaffold. We built this suite up just so we could get to the next step. But this thingy here isn't really testing anything that the next one isn't testing, that the next one isn't testing, that the next one isn't testing, that the next one isn't testing. So what happens if I just take out all of those tests and say it can actually score points? It can score points. Would that be an accurate representation of what we've done so far? Let's see what happens. It turns out there's one case that we miss when we do this. And what's that case? It means we never, yeah, that's my bad. So what it says it could change this plus into a minus because it never actually scores in the example that I left behind. It never scores the second row. Does that make sense to everyone? If I'm going too fast, this is a good moment to yell, "Caw-caw!" Do it silently so nobody will think you're weird. So how do we fix this? Yeah, let's do this one. This one looks good to me. So yeah, sure. Let's do that. Perfect. That's a really good suggestion. So what happens? Voila. This gives you confidence. You know what you've done works, what works you've done.
Would you recommend throwing away the other test then?
Yes. I would recommend in this instance being a little bit facetious about keeping the two in here. Do try out different numbers, etc. But what's important is that you want a test suite that describes as distinct and short as possible, but as complete as possible, what your code does, because that's living documentation. I don't know, I think PEST does this out of the box, but you can run PHP unit with test docs, and it will actually say, what are the capacities of your code? Well, the capacity of my code is that the golden class allows me to score points. That's the capacity of my code. This is living documentation. So the downside of doing TDD and then stopping is that you write a lot of tests that are superfluous documentation. It's too much. You use it as scaffolding, and then at certain checkpoints, you take out the test that you know want. So far, so good? A question.
It does feel to me, I'm not a developer, for things to say, but I do something once in a while. Besides, I feel that if you do delete everything,
Yes.
so you say it's superfluous
Yes.
documentation, that you're losing a little bit of context that might help
Yes.
translating knowledge to someone else. How
Yes.
do you cover for that?
Yes, so there's the question is, as you remove those tests, it looks like you're losing context. So you can't pass it on as easily to someone else who maybe wasn't there or who was there and then went and then came back and it's like, what? Yes, that is true to a degree, in the same way that when you build a building and then take out the scaffolding, you have just a building left. It's like, but how did it get here? It's like, well, people are able to do these things. And the same thing goes for these tests. You're supposed to, and that's where it's different from the scaffolding example, you're supposed to leave behind what's relevant. So there is thinking involved. I made the choice here because I know this case a little bit, etc. You can do that together with other people because there's no readable code, there's no readable documentation like what other people tell you is readable. Often when you have discussions on readable code, you're like, but I think this is readable, I think that's readable. Well, if you can read my code, then I've got readable code. I'm not the judge of that, you are. And the same thing goes for this. So if you take out the test, yeah, maybe get some feedback. Do you feel like this describes what I'm doing it? If you want to have an excellent presentation on naming of tests, Google Kathleen Henny. Kathleen Henny has a really, really good presentation on test naming. Any other questions so far at this checkpoint? Excellent. What's the next test?
Stairs and stripes.
Yeah, let's check for stairs and stripes. So let's do the first one. The bowling thingy can bowl a span. So that could look something like this, for example. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You can tell I'm a professional. This is not what I wanted at all. Sorry. Yeah. 7, 8, 9, 10.
Why does it matter that we use exactly 10? Because we've never specified that it's 10.
Yeah, a good question. Something I didn't mention in the introduction, which is what happens when you ignore your slides and just do a random jump in. Validation is not a part of the bowling kata because that means it would just take too long. So if one of the cool things about doing katas is you can do them with a twist. So the twist that we're using today is only TBD and something ifs, which we'll get to. But you can also do it with a twist like, no, I want to have full-on validation. I want to do this using a recursive descent parser. Yeah, good luck. Very awesome, but very difficult. Or more difficult than just doing that. So yeah, good question. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. No validation needed because it's already difficult enough. So we failed that one matches the expected 10. Why is this? Oh, that's actually a really good point. So what do we do? Should we just go here? If the encodable is a slash gen 10, does that work?
Let's do it in frame.
Ah, sorry?
Let's do it in frame.
Because?
This is the second one.
Yeah.
Total scores you can.
Yes. So we don't have the information that we need in this function to deal with this functionality. That's a really cool part about software development. One of the things that is the bane of our existence is getting the appropriate amount of information at the space that we need to make a decision. So instead we have to do it here. That is very accurate. So if this character, I think, so far so good, then just 10. Shazam. What's the next test? Strike. Well, you could say so, but I think there were some rules involved with the spare.
There's level.
Or just a normal throw.
Yeah. What should be the score for this one? Yeah. And what are we expecting?
Score. Normal score.
Spare, something like this. So yeah, it's going to give us 11, but we're expecting 12, I think. That's what you were saying? Yes. What do we do?
We have to know the previous frame.
We have some of the previous frame. Yes. Yes. Things are becoming increasingly more complex. Because we have a decision being made somewhere here, we need it here, and that's all. So what do we do? Well, one of the things that we like to do is, for argument's sake, we'll mark this one skipped. What we like to do is, anytime we try to make changes to our system, we try to stay as close to green as possible. So any change that we make, because changing code is really hard and really complex and really dangerous, we'd like to stay as close to green as possible. So what can we do here to stay close to green and still make some magic happen? We need some information here, for example. So what we could do is we could say, I'm expecting here the previous string score or something like that. And we run it and it goes wrong. So we'll do 0 there. And it's green. Now we can do something. Score here. That still works. We can do previous string score in here. That breaks. Why does that break? Excellent. So we do it here. That's great. So far so good. This was exciting. I don't like changing code. Okay, so can we make this one work now? So if we execute this one, anything else? What can we then do? This, and does it then work? Oh, it doesn't work. Why doesn't it work?
You should double the current score.
It's not actually a previous one.
Oh, yeah, of course.
So this is a change I can easily make because I'm somewhat familiar with this problem. So doing normal TDD, you would do something like this. You would stare at it for a second. You would try around a little bit, and then you would find this one. The changes that we're making are absolutely tiny, and running the tests all the time, and continuously making sure that we bring the information to the place that we need to make that decision. But what's the next test? Two squares in a row? Yeah, sure. Score 2 spares. Oop. So what are we expecting? So let's say we do this and this. What should come out of this? So this one's 1. This one's 10 plus 1. This one's 10 plus 1, so it should be 23. Is that accurate? 23, 23 of the deal power. So this might be a good moment for us to check out bowlinggenius.com. So we had 0, 9. 1, 9, 1, 23. Yes? Okay, 23. Oh, what? Dat was pas voor vanavond. So 23, 23 is supposed to be the outcome of this one, but we get 33. Why did we get 33?
Because it doubles the previous score. The previous score is 11, is 10.
Yeah.
Or 12.
We're passing the whole frame, but we're not supposed to pass the whole frame. We're just supposed to pass the first roll of that frame. How can we solve for this? I think it's time to introduce an object. Because we have a decision here that we only want to partially get something from. So again, how do we get towards this stage with as few changes as possible? So let's start with something like, that sounds sensible, right? Just trying to have, too slow, bro. Buttons. There you go. A first row. A second row. Yes, no, agree, disagree? Okay. So what can we do with this one? How can we make the changes small? So let's start here. Let's say we're going to introduce a frame here. That's going to go bust. So what do we do here? We probably need something like this. Does this still work? It does not, because it must be a type frame, but we're passing in a date. Okay, so let's change this one. Now where does it go bust? It says the previous frame score must be a bottom frame int given, and that is because the result of this one is an int. So this one should also return a frame. That's going to go bust because of this. So this is going to do, and then row 4. See how awful it is to have these big changes? Yes, row, thank you. 4, that one. And then this one should just be that. And then that. I can actually tell that during these kinds of exercises, during these bigger steps, I get much more uncomfortable. And this one is supposed to be score. And the one that we don't have is bonus roll for a spare, of course, because that's what we've now ruined. But the bonus roll for a spare is somewhere in here. So how can we get it from here to here? Pass in the previous string. And then we can here do another stupid thing, which is if this first row plus this second row is 10, we get 10 plus this previous string, and that's going to go broke because we don't have the previous string in here, and it's actually not the score anymore. Buttons. And in here as well. And the only thing left is probably at top. Just this one. This is shit. That's great. That's
Are you
great.
now running inflection? Does it then still work?
That is a really good question.
Yeah, because it's gonna make them frame over.
In the meetup, we have about 5 minutes.
Yeah, I think all of comments probably. If people want to stop, then that's fine. Otherwise, we might go on a little bit more. There's only one thing I really wanted to show anyway. If you're still enjoying yourself, then feel free to sit. Otherwise, if you all collectively go, then I know gracefully exit the stage. So, but it's fine. It's able to change 1, 2, 3, 4 numbers without any effect. Do we care about these ones? Nah, not at all. We do care about something else. Because we've made an object-oriented boo-boo. You laugh, but this is serious stuff. What's the object-oriented boo-boo that we made? That I made? I forced you into this. Yes. Yeah. I will tell you, because we're not going to get to that the null one is going to magically disappear when you account for the bonus frame. We're not going to get to that today. But there is a boo-boo in here, because this is actually the same if as this one. There's a principle in object-oriented programming called the one-true switch. Your system should never take the same decision twice. All of you, after this session, you can never write an enum anymore, because enums are the worst offender of the one-true switch. An enum, by its very definition, will trigger you to write the same if more than once. Every time you do that, an interface dies. Polymorphism is the way to deal with this. So what is happening here? Well, what's happening is we have two kinds of frames. There is a frame hidden in here that wants to have this, it wants to come out, it wants to be its own thing. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this frame, we're going to name it a regular frame. I'm fine with all of this. It still does. I'm going to take out an interface. And it's going to be called frame, because the interface is the real thing. Don't name your interface as interface. I'm offending an adequate amount of people, I hope. So this bowling game, it does instantiate a regular frame here. It does expect a regular frame here, because I missed the button that it should probably change all of these for frame. That's on me. This is, yeah, that's fine. Still runs, still runs. So what we can do now that we have this one, is we can actually take this one and implement the spare. And that has some requirements to it, because we need to calculate the score. How do we calculate the score? Well, we only need to know about the first roll with the spare. Because the score here is 10 plus the previous, which I also need to declare. Previous. And then I no longer have access to its private variables, so I need to declare the first roll method as well. That goes on the interface. If I run my code, it still works. No, it doesn't, because regular frame does not implement this. I go to regular frame, I implement this first roll method, which should be relatively simple. That passes again, but we haven't made the change yet, so this cannot be a spare. It doesn't need this one anymore. It still passes, it don't want to pass. Spare contains abstract method, of course. We expected it and then did not implement it ourselves. And it passes again. And now we can go back to regular frame and just take this out. Take this out, fix where it goes wrong. I wish I could click on that. Fortunately, we can now. There and here. We've dealt with the null, we've dealt with the if. So far, so good?
A question about it. Before you started this, you said the if statements, the two if statements practically tested the same thing.
Yes.
It seems like we kind of do that because you know this exercise, but how do you process the thing?
So what I said at the start is if you solve a test by doing if blah is 2, and then solve the next test by doing if blah is 3, that's not good. That's not allowed in TDD. And in this instance, I'm saying if you do object-oriented programming and you find that your system is making the same decision twice, then that's also not good. So it's both, in both instances, it's about ifs, but it's two separate problems. The first one is called the transformation priority premise. This is called the one true switch, or one true if. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but that's not my question.
Sorry.
The one true switch, what you mentioned just now, you said look, those two are the same. What is a good way to spot the two if statements that do the same thing in a complex application?
Yeah, because of course they were two different ifs. So what is a good way to spot that your system is taking the same decision multiple times? Enums are that giveaway. Sorry to hate on enums. Enums are that giveaway. But the real dead giveaway is what you've actually seen us do here. Your code really only does a couple of different things. So here we have a bit of code that does a bit of parsing. Parsing is always going to have ifs. But the one thing that parsing is supposed to do is lead from a situation without information to a situation with information. So your parsing step, the step that your code takes to transform from a stringly typed environment to a domain environment, to use fancy pants words, that is the step where you basically make decisions. After that, if you spot another if, highly likely that that if is a violator. So the goal of this style of coding is when you have an incoming request from outside, you transform that request, you gather the right objects, and after that, there should be no more ifs. So typically an application will have branching trees, branching trees, branching trees, but a properly modeled, object-oriented application has branching trees, rainforest. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Thank you for clarifying your question. One more thing that I want to do, sorry to violate the time, but Bobby's allowed me, I'm really sorry. How difficult would it be to implement Strike?
Similar, you have to create a new frame.
Let's just immediately jump to this one and go for 2 strikes, because if there's one thing I wanted to show today is that you can take big enough steps. So this is 21, this is 11, and this is 1, so this should be 33. What?
See the ads again?
You just wanted to show that red lady there. Oh, there you go, Bobby. So let's do 10, 10, 1, 33. Yeah, and that's actually her number, so.
0800 producers.
Would it work with just the X and not 2 characters?
Would it work with just the X and, can you repeat?
It's all sets of 2 characters, but the X is just 1 character right now.
Yeah.
Would that work?
Yeah, because we're splitting based on space, right?
Yes
Frame is
and no. I highly recommend you to do the Bowman Kata yourself, because there might be some complexity around that. Exceptions always possible. This is like typical business requirements, but it's like, oh, but it's only 1 character. That's easier for you, right? Well, it's actually,
Yeah.
Thank you for thinking with me, but I'd like to think myself, except when coding, because I don't like thinking when coding. How do we solve this? It's saying it's 1. That's not right. It's not 1. How do we fix it? If it's an X, then a new strike. So why wouldn't we write a unit test for strike and a unit test for spare and a unit test for regular frame?
Just test the interface. Because the interface, they're implementing the interface.
Yes.
And yeah,
Yes.
it's depending on the class, the implementation of the interface. So you really do not have to test them. So you can mock also if you wanted to.
Yeah.
I mean,
I have opinions on mocking as well,
yeah, I don't like
which
it
we
either.
probably shouldn't get into because I'm already offended Bobby quite enough. Not offended, but my card might have some different marks on it when we get back to it. Oh, you can tell I'm a very experienced developer. Previous, and then first row, and then, now what? Second row, yeah, that's the second row. So let's run the test, what breaks? Everything. Oh. So there's actually an RFC going on allowing,
implementation.
yeah,
Yes.
worst idea ever.
Well, not for this.
Well, this is exactly the kind of situation that is meant for, I do agree.
Why don't you use an abstract class?
Because abstract classes use inheritance, and if you go to Twitter these days, inheritance is evil, so you can never use it.
You don't want to be cancelled on Twitter.
Yes. Yes, think of your social credit score.
Should be second floor.
Cool. And we have strike. It should be second row.
In spare you return first.
Spares don't have the second row, just as the first row. See, this is the kind of things that this approach allows you to do. Tiny bits of business logic in particular classes. No ifs, no else's, no buts, except on that website. So we just have to go here, the if, and code frame. It's always use triplets. Buttons. And then strike. It just gets the previous frame, and then the previous frame doesn't have implementations for the. The strike doesn't have the implementation yet that it caused. So what's the first rule for a strike? It's just 10. What's the second rule for a strike? Doesn't exist. So we'll just ask the previous for the first rule. And back. Homework. This bowling game now has two functions that have the same ifs. No, it doesn't. Is there anything else I wanted to show? Is there anything else you want to see?
The three strikes.
3 strikes at the end. Yeah, that's going to take too much time. So I'm more than happy to do that, but I don't want to ruin your schedule. So we probably should leave it at this. Does anyone have any questions or skating rules?
Does this lead to functional programming in some way? Because I feel like we're splitting everything in small parts.
No. Functional program and object-oriented program in that sense have the same goal. If you ask Alan Kay, the original Mr. Object-oriented programming, then object orientation is about late binding, locality, message passing, and something else I forgot. A wonderful list of basically saying solve small problems, combine them into bigger solutions. So that's why I have a particular hatred for things like object properties or enums or abstract classes or whatever, because it's all very counter to the original goal of object-oriented programming, which in its essence solves the same issue as functional programming, but in exactly the opposite way. Because functional programming is a hard separation between data and process, where object orientation is a hard combine between data and process. Good question.
Just to time frame a little bit the question, time that we still have about 3, 4, 5 minutes. So,
Oh, then we can do the bonus frame.
is there anyone who is like other questions apart from the bonus frame? Or are we good? And then we want to watch this again.
I think it's maybe quite a bit enough for.
Yeah. Do we need more mutants on the screen, or is that?
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, let's run infection one more time, because infection will actually find a couple of things here. Can you predict what infection is going to find? No, probably not. Infection will still have that same 0000 thingy. But infection actually does find some interesting things here. So it says I can do 0, yes, 0, 0, yes, 0, 1, 1, 0, 0, yeah, okay, cool. But what is uncovered is actually we've never tested using the second roll of a spare for the bonus first strike. This is a case that we have not covered. Infection is an amazing tool for confidence building. There is a path in this code base that is untested. Not by coverage. Actual, here's the thing that I can do that breaks your code. Test. Yeah. Same one here. So sometimes you will have the same thing twice because it's that's just what the tool does. Or thrice. So we actually there's just one test case missing, and then we have this fixed. Cool. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope that after this, yes, the TDD is nice. Yes, the one true if blah is nice. But please use all the resources available, like the bowling kata, but there's so many more katas out there. Use this, practice with your team, try out different approaches. We do it just 1 hour every 2 weeks. So we have every Friday after lunch, we have either a code kata or a presentation. So that makes sure that we have some base skill building as well as knowledge sharing. Try out these katas. It helps you to build your skills out amazingly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pim. And also thank you for rushing a little bit on the end. I think it was a very impressive presentation, and good to see this happening in all life and seeing, really what happens when you make certain mistakes. Wrap you around the whole mindset of things. So great. I think it would also be good to gather some links and maybe some of the advice that you share, so we can share it with you as a single message, and that not everybody is still coordinating weird bowling websites to find the right information. So thanks again. Now we will have a short break, about 15 minutes. Let's try to be back here about 2020. 3 years ago. So to take a quick toilet break, the toilet is next to the the escape room logo, so then you know where to go. Grab some drinks, stretch your legs, and then we'll see you back here in 15 minutes.
Als je wil nog wat drinken? Biertje?
Reflection is wel.
Hoeveel live views? 0.
Ik denk dat het wel te beslag is.
Niet eens jezelf. Je hebt niet haast. Nee,
Ik had met naast.
ja, maar.
Okay, 2,713. But maybe there's more questions coming up.
3,000 today,
Yeah. So thank you for joining us today. You will speak something about consistent Laravel.
Yes.
I like the pizza already.
Yes.
Yeah, so good luck with your talk.
Thanks.
And have fun.
Thanks. Yeah, welcome. Thank you for having me. I'm talking about consistent Laravel today. Is there anyone who never worked with Laravel before here? Did you ever work with PHP before? Have you ever heard of Laravel before? Okay, you're gonna be in love with Laravel today. No, I can't promise anything, but so we'll go over the code base and see what defaults are and how we can use them to make consistent code. So I'm Bobby Bouwmann, as already mentioned. I think it's amazing to be here again. I think I've been here for 4 times now. And yeah, you can look me up on Bobby Bouwmann on the internet. I'm always this username. I work at Hospitable. I'm a software engineer there. We build vacation rental software, so we basically try to give the host their time back. And we do that by synchronizing across platforms, for example, Airbnb and Booking.com. We have one place where all the reservations comes in. We have one centralized inbox, and we automate everything around that. So if you ever decide to rent out a house somewhere, try Hospitable. Our biggest market is America, so but it's way bigger there with Airbnb, and there are a lot more parties there. But we have some Dutch customers. But our main development team is in Europe, so that's why I'm working at Hospitable. Together with my buddy Stefan Bauer, we run Ping, which is an uptime monitoring tool. And we are by far the fastest. We check every 30 seconds. And we'll let you know if your website is down. I'm working on a new version, which will come out hopefully at the end of the year, otherwise early next year. So keep an eye on that. Consistency is key. So whatever you do with your code base, do it consistent, and that will help. So even like Pim showed, running your test every time. If you're doing TDD, run your test every time. That makes it consistent, and then you're way more powerful with that. So when doing something consistently, it becomes more powerful, and it becomes more of like a habit or like a routine. And especially because we're programmers, we like to automate these routines. And I will show you how Laravel helps with that, doing that, and I will also show you how what kind of tools can help with that. So what are we talking about today? We're talking about the Laravel defaults. We're talking about the tools that might help with that. And we're going to talk about safety mechanisms that are built into the Laravel code base. So this is something a little bit new. Most of these things are introduced in Laravel 9, but not a lot of people know about them. So that's why I'm talking about them. You will see every slide has pizzas. That's like a thing. I started with that on my first talk ever, and then I tried to change it. I went to India for Laracon India. I was presenting there. I changed the food from pizzas to Indian food, and then everybody was like, "Where are the pizzas?" So now I'm back to pizzas again. So sad for you. It's just going to say pizzas. So if you work with Laravel before, you probably already use most of these defaults, and I will just show you them today so you know a little bit more about them. You might create your own defaults. If you could just go through the documentation, you can already see a lot of these defaults. Laravel is very consistent in that in the documentation, and it also has tools for that. So, but first, why do we use defaults? Well, it's for hiring Laravel developers. Because if you hire a developer, you want to know for sure that they can do the job they need to do. And if they know Laravel, they can probably start earlier on the project. You don't have to spend 2 months learning them how to structure your code or how your PHP classes are all connected to each other. If you use defaults, then it's way easier for them to start working on the code base. And especially with junior developers, they already need to learn so many things around it, writing tests, learning the domain. That's all very hard to do already. So if you already know how to structure your code, where are controllers stored, how are models connected to each other, how are things named, if you make them all defaults, then it's much easier to hire developers and to get them started on your Laravel project. Laravel itself understands the default. So we will see a lot of these code examples where Laravel actually looks up for defaults, so you don't have to specify certain things, and the defaults will do a lot of things for you, so it makes your code a lot more readable. So think about setting up relationships between classes, generating classes. Those things are all using defaults, and if you just use those, it becomes really easy and really fast to set up your application or prototype something. So we'll see most of those code examples later. And when you're maintaining multiple projects or have a company with multiple projects, it's really nice that if you sometimes want to switch contacts, you can go to a different team or a different project and work there. If it is, well, it's very amazing. If you have the same defaults, the same structure there, you just need to change to the domain, but you can still do the same coding. So it makes it really easy to switch projects, and so on. So I think that's a really nice way to use the defaults. I do that on my own project as well. If I have my personal projects, they all are structured the same way because it makes it a lot easier for me to go back to the project, make some changes, and continue because I know that structure. I know what I'm expected to do. I know where to find certain things. So that makes it a lot easier. And I think you probably all have that as well. If you make your own projects, you use a certain structure and you try to apply that as well at your job, or at least try to do that where possible. So that's why defaults are really important. And then again, it doesn't really matter what you use as defaults, as long as you stick to it. That the consistency is really key. It's really important to do that. Okay, let's look at some naming conventions. So Laravel itself uses singular naming for controllers, plural for routes. Here are just some examples. If you follow most of these things, it's really easy to keep working with it. I'm more of a fan of using plural controllers. But if you generate a class in general in Laravel, it generates the singular one. So for this example, we're going to use the singular one, but I will refactor it to plural. And the same goes for models and naming things. Yeah, we will see most of these in code examples as well. So Laravel has this amazing tool called Artisan, which is like a helper to bootstrap your project. We have a make command in there, so you can run php artisan make and then a name of something, and then you can make that class. So for example, make a model or make a migration. And it will generate the PHP class for you, and it will pre-fill some things. So if you say make model a reservation, it will create a reservation class with the correct extensions of model in this case. It will store it in the correct directory and so on. And Laravel does this for almost all the things like controllers, migrations, events, listeners, policies. We'll name it, and there are make commands. And if there is no command for it, there's probably a Spatie package that does have the command for you. So in general, these templates only give you these commands only give you the template that you need. You still need to think about the naming. You are still free to name whatever you want. So let's have a look at how we can do it. So normally you would type php artisan make model and then pass in the model name. Since Laravel 10, we don't have to do that anymore. You can just say php artisan make model, press enter, and then it will give you a bleeping thing you can type. And then you can type the reservation name. In this case, I'm going to name a model reservation. You type the model name, press enter, and then it will go on and ask you more questions to generate those classes. In this case, it will say, well, do you want to add anything else? Well, in this case, none or all, or one of these specific ones. Press in the number, press enter, and it will generate the class for you with that model name. And the cool thing is that if it generates one of these classes as well, it will use the reservation name as a basis and use that. So for example, if we create a policy, it will say reservation policy. If we create a migration, and migrations are plural, so it will say create reservations table, and it will generate that PHP file. So that's already using a lot of defaults. You only have to type one thing, and it generates all the things that are all connected. And that makes it really easy to work with it. So the output of this is if you run php artisan make model reservation and you say all, you get a bunch of classes that are generated. And Laravel is so nice to say where they are stored as well. And so these are defaults as well, right? We have request classes are stored in the HTTP request directory. We have controllers that are always stored in the controllers directory. So there's already a really good structure in Laravel where everything is stored, and it's really easy to find. So if you go to a new project, the first thing I do when I go to a project is I go to the routes file and see where all the routes are. And then from each route, I can see, oh, there are controllers. I can go through the controller. But by just knowing the structure of Laravel, and if the project is using that structure, I can already find everything in the project that I need to know to understand the project. So that's a really good starting point for me to understand what's going on. If you're going to change all of that, it becomes really hard to understand the project if you're really new to the project. Okay, that brings us to migrations, and I picked out migrations separately because the database also has some defaults in there, which are really useful, so I didn't want to miss on those. Let's have a look. So if we generate a reservation in general, or if we generate a migration for a reservation in this case, if we use the command we did before, it would only put in the table ID and the timestamps. Those are the defaults that are in the migration file when you create it. But the rest are all extra columns. So Laravel has some nice methods to generate default columns. For example, the UUID column, it will make sure that it has the correct structure in the database. And if you don't pass in any string, it will use the UUID as a name. But the more interesting one is, for example, soft deletes, where you have a really nice method, but it always generates the deleted at string. And the timestamps also generated the created at and updated at fields automatically for you in the database. And these fields are really readable for you, right? You can create it at really means, okay, it's created at that point. So you know what they're doing and you understand them. And Laravel understands both of these or all of these columns automatically. So if you have a model, the created at is basically almost always there, unless you turn it off. So Laravel knows those defaults. And for soft deletes, the same thing. There's a trait that you can import in your model saying use soft deletes. And then Laravel understands that the deleted at column is used. So that's a default already. And so what you can do is if you want to add another timestamp, you use that same structure. You use confirmed at, for example. And that at really is the default convention and that you can reuse. I think that's it. Yes. So if we then go to a relationship, for example, so we have a reservation with messages, we would have a table called reservation messages or a table called messages. And in here, we would structure how models are connected to each other. So in this case, we say a reservation message is connected to a user that's sending the message, but it's also connected to a reservation. So if we tell Laravel that the foreign ID is connected to a user ID, and then we call the method constraint, Laravel will automatically create the foreign key constraint for that. And because we use the defaults, Laravel understands this. Because constraint is user ID, and it knows, hey, user ID, I know that string. So based on that, it will try to find the table name, which is users, and then it automatically makes the connection for you in the foreign key constraint. So Laravel is very smart with that. You can also specify it in the constraint method, but why would you do that if it's just the default? So if you stick to the default, this becomes really easy. And there's also a way to use, for example, foreign ID 4 and then a model class that also works. This is really nice because it uses the get table method from the model to determine the table name. And in the end, it will be the user ID, and it also generates the foreign key constraint that comes with that, which is this one. So there's also convention in the indexes, in this case, the foreign key constraint. There's one downside of using foreign ID 4. If you change your model name, then this migration doesn't work anymore. So if you later set up your project again, you run the migrations, it will fail because you renamed the model and then it doesn't understand what to do anymore. So I'm more of a fan of using the above one. But yeah, that's up to you, I guess. I think I have everything here. Yes. So that brings us to relationships. We saw how the database is structured for relationships. So let's see how a relationship works in Laravel. So if we use the defaults here again, then we call the relationship the same as the model name. And with that, or the plural form if you have as many one, Laravel will automatically understand that, okay, we're connecting these two by their name. So I don't have to do any specific database options here to understand what's going on. For example, the user one, if we say belongs to user, then Laravel understands that if I want to grab the user from the reservation, if I call this user method on reservation, it will automatically use the user ID column to determine the ID of the users table to grab that user. So that are all default conventions. And the same goes, for example, for belongs to many. Here we have, for example, a reservation as services, and it belongs to many always has a pivot table. So we have a services table, we have a reservations table, and there's a table in between the service reservation table or the reservation service table. Which one is it? So Laravel uses conventions for that. And the convention is alphabetical order. So it will use reservation service as a table name. And as long as you don't specify anything, it will use that default. So if you sometimes create a pivot table and you have the alphabetical order incorrect, happens to me as well. In that case, your test or your code will fail and it will say, I can't find that table because Laravel doesn't understand which table it should use. The same goes, for example, for a morph relationship where the model name and the ID is stored in the database. We have to give it a name. So in this case, we can't do it without the name because Laravel doesn't understand it then. You have to have a common name in there. But this also uses the same kind of structure. It uses the defaults to get to the correct model. So if you name it differently, you have to specify that. And we can be very, it's very easy to do that. You always have the model name, then the foreign key name, so from the other table, and then your own local name for the column that connects the two. So in this case, reservation messages ID and reservation ID to connect them. And for the belongs to many, there's a little bit more things. In this case, if we have a different pivot table name, we have to specify it here, and then we have to specify the foreign key names as well to be specific. But yeah, I'd rather use the defaults because it's easier to read. And also like one line versus all of this, the one line is just easier to read. Even though you might have a different table name that you might not like maybe the reservation connected services sounds better as a table name, but the defaults have so much more benefits over the table name, in my opinion. So yeah, I would use that instead. But in the end, you're free to change whatever you want. It's Laravel, you're free to use whatever you want, but we just love the defaults. Okay, so now I'm gonna hurt Pim with Laravel structures, directory structures. No, it's all right. So I love the Laravel default structure. It already gives enough information what you can use, even for big projects. I work at Hospital with we have a really big project. We can't stick to the defaults, sadly. I would love to do that, but we just outgrew that. But you can still use the defaults in some kind of way, and we will go over those options today. So we're going to look at the alternatives, but first we're going to do a basic one. But first we need to understand how Laravel is set up at all. So Laravel uses Composer and autoload. So what this line basically says is that every file and directory in Laravel, in the app directory, is autoloaded automatically. So any file that you store in the app directory is available and is scanned by Composer, so you can use it inside your code. So this is really important because this gives us flexibility inside the code base. We can use whatever structure we want, even though Laravel provides a default one. And the same goes for tests. I always like to follow the same test structure as my app structure. So if I have an app HTTP controllers, there's a test test HTTP controllers and then a controller test name as well. I like to follow that structure to keep it very clear that what class has a test and which one is missing a test. But if you have a really big code base, it can become really hard to see which classes are missing something. So you can use tools like infection or code coverage to see what is going on there. Another thing that you can do is put the test class next to your own class. So your controller class has a test class next to it. You just need to configure your PHP unit to also scan the app directory for test classes, and it just works. That's also a really nice way of doing it. And we're doing it at Hospitable because it just makes it really clear that every class has a test as well. So if we look at the default Laravel structure, we get like the app directory and then all these other classes. Actions and services are not there by default, but in very modern applications and a lot of Laravel tools already, actions and services are pretty common to use. And then the rest is all generated. If you open up a new project, you only get like 3 or 4 directories. Once you create an event using p2r to make event, it will also generate the event class. And if you generate a listener, it will generate the listener directory and so on. So that's more to keep it clean. If you don't need it, don't put it there. No empty directories. We don't like that. Yeah, that's it for the default one. Yeah, so since we are loading every class in the app directory, we can also create subclasses in here, so or subdirectories. So for example, actions can have like a billable directory or a billing directory, and then all the code in there. So if we look at that, for example, we have the domain billing inside our application. We can have an action class with in there a billing one, and then there the action class in there. And the same goes for commands, and the same goes for notifications, and so on. So we can provide our code in here. But as you can imagine, if you have like 20 different domains and every domain has 5 classes, that means there are 100 classes under actions. And that might be a little bit harder to read, already harder to find. But it's still my preferred way of setting things up. Even if you have 100 classes in the directory, you can probably still find it. You probably already know most of the domain, but it becomes a little bit harder. So you might need a little bit more subdirectories to just get a little bit more structure in there. But yeah, you will find the structure in there once you need it. So an alternative is using a domain setup. And Laravel already works with this because we already load every directory in the apps directory. So for example, we can add a domain folder and then add in all the other ones that we need. So for example, billing, calendar, inbox, whatever we need in there. And then in there, we would put our domain logic, and we can call that from our all our other actions. And in there, we can add the actions that we actually need, the commands, notifications. So this is a way to make it clearer that we have this information there as well. But it also comes with a downside because, for example, the commands, Laravel automatically loads all the commands in the app console directory. But if you don't put your commands in there or you don't register it in there, it's not loaded in the application. So you either have to find a way to load it, or you have to update that code to automatically load other directories as well. So that's something to keep in mind. Like the default Laravel structure doesn't allow for this for everything. For most things it works, but for commands, for example, and events and listeners, those are not automatically registered. So you have to do some kind of action on your own to make that work. So if we look at the kernel one for console, so if you go to the app console directory, there's a kernel.php file. This file registers all the commands that are in the console commands directory. So as you can see here, we load all the commands, and then we load all the console commands as well that you can register on the fly if you don't want to create a class for it. But this one only loads one directory. So if you put up your domain logic and you put in commands there, well, you have to auto-load it here as well. But of course, you don't want to do that for every domain that you add, right? So you need to find some kind of structure in there. Maybe just scan the whole directory. That might also work. Might make your application a little bit slower, only on initialization. But after that, it's fine. So yeah, we already covered those. Let's go. So I also want to talk about a module setup, which is a little bit more the extreme version of domains. So if we talk about Laravel, Laravel is set up in service provider. So every service provider registers something inside the application. So if we look, for example, at the notification service provider, it will register all the classes that are needed to understand notifications. And the same goes for routing. The same goes for the database. We need to register it in Laravel. So Laravel doesn't work without these service providers because they set up the whole application. So every feature in Laravel can be seen as a small package that is loaded through a service provider. And we can use that same approach for each model that we have. So this setup is very similar to the domains one, but except we now have a service provider for each of our domains. And this service provider will help us register everything we need for the application. So for example, if we add a command in billing, we would add some logic to the billing service provider to load that command automatically for us. And the same goes for, so in here, for example, we have the command and we have a listener and an event and a listener. So normally we would have some information here, or we would use some kind of package to do this for us. I also written the code for you, so you can do it on your own. You can loop over the commands. You can loop over the events and listeners. But as you can see, this is pretty complex. You don't want to copy paste it every time. There are like a ton of packages that do this for you, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. But yeah, this is a really nice way to set up those modules and still have all the flexibility of Laravel. But yeah, you can find the package on your own. Yeah, I think there's like a ton of them. So my recommendation is to stay as close as possible to the Laravel defaults as long as possible. And that's just because you want to get those developers in that actually know the structure and can work with that. So consistency is key there. But if you decide to go to such a module setup, that's fine, as long as you're consistent. Don't do it in one direction and not in the other. Just stay consistent. Make sure that you have a service provider everywhere and so on. So you're ready to extend that. So I just want to discuss some tools that you can use to get better at the defaults. So let's see what we have here. So we're going to talk about code style. We're going to talk about static analysis and writing tests for your code style. So Laravel comes with a tool called Laravel Pint, and it's beer, so it's good. And when you run this, it will basically run the PSR checkers with the Laravel flavor over it. So if you start a new project, include this, run this every time before you push, you're good. You have a default code style. It's using PHP-CS fixer, so you can override it if you want to, but like the default is already pretty good to use. It looks like this. So when you run it, it says, I'm fixing those things. For example, no unused imports, blank lines after a namespace, or those kind of small things. They all ultimately get fixed. And that's just really nice to have as a tool. This is a really basic one. You can, for example, add this to your pre-commit hook if you want to. So you always run it before continuing your work. And this really helps with a consistent code style in the whole project. Of course, this doesn't fix like someone using a lot of ifs or a lot of else statements. You need other tools for that. But for the code style, this already helps. And a really good code style also makes your code base really good looking, and that really helps with development, at least, I think. Okay. So the next one is Larastan, or PHP Stan, basically. Larastan is a wrapper around PHP Stan. So PHP Stan is a static analysis tool. So what it does, it runs over your code, and it will check if a certain function is called with a certain parameter, and it checks against types, for example. So if you have a function that only allows ints, but you're calling that function with a string, it will throw an error saying, hey, you're trying to call this with a string, but it only allows integers. And the same goes for return types, missing return types, those kind of things. So this really superpowers your application already on bugs. It can already find bugs for you, just like infection. And I think infection would be a good tool to add to this as well. PHP Stan also has options to extend, so you can add your own functions in there. I will show you another tool after this. That's pretty cool, but PHP Stan can do the same thing. But I will discuss the other two and then go back to PHP Stan. But in the end, it's just a wrapper around PHP Stan. Larastan is just a wrapper around PHP Stan. So in here, we just extend the Laravel Stan extension one. You specify which folders it needs to run and then a level. If you do level 9, it becomes really annoying because some things are just not possible, especially when you use a framework or you use a package. Like sometimes they just don't have return types, or they don't have certain type hints, for example. And then level 9 will really be, damn, you have to fix that. But there's a fix for that. There's a baseline. You can generate a baseline. It will skip those things as well. But yeah, if you start with this, so if you have a project already running, you add this. Generate the baseline first and make sure you don't adjust the baseline anymore. You can only remove from the baseline and not add to the baseline anymore. And that will increase your code as well. So it will make your code more beautiful with PHP Stan. So it's a really powerful tool, and it just runs there. Okay, how does that look like? Well, if you run it, it will say, hey, this parameter expects an array or string. You give it an int. Well, that's very clear, right? We already know what the error is. We can easily fix this, or we can add an extra if statement or throw an exception, whatever we want. So that's really powerful. So that brings me to PEST. Who here heard about PEST? Okay, so PEST is a testing framework, but it's a layer over PHP unit. So you can see it like it's PHP unit on steroids, I guess, just like collections is an array on steroids. So PEST makes it really nice to write tests. There's a nice way of writing tests. But they released a new feature this year called architecture testing. So what does this do? We can write tests to enforce certain code styles. So for example, we can say that the models are the only one that are allowed to interact with the database. So this is really powerful. Now we can just say, okay, your models are the only one that can talk to the database. So you can't talk to the database directly anymore in your controllers. You need to go through a model. Or you need to use a repository. Your models can only be used inside a repository. So this enforces repository throughout your whole application. We don't want DDDs on production. Well, we can enforce that. We don't want them here. We don't want them on production either. We don't want facades. Some people don't like them. We can turn it off. We can enforce to not use it anymore. So these are just a few examples. I have a few more. But this really helps you to enforce a certain structure inside your code. It's not perfect. It does a lot of cool things. It doesn't do all the things yet, but it's a really good start to enforce your application to run certain things. And the beautiful thing about it, it's already part of your testing suite. If you run this, it will just scan your files. It will be a little bit slower than just running a unit test, of course, because it needs to scan all the files. But it will help you for sure prevent certain actions. We recently had a deployment where someone did carbon set test now in a service provider and deployed that, and then everything had the same date in the database. Well, we can prevent that by doing this. So that's really powerful to have. So those kind of things are, even if it happens after, like, even if something happens, you can at least write a test for it to make sure it never happens again. So we have that test now in our suite. But yeah, so PHP Stand can do this too. PHP Stand you can write plugins or extensions for PHP Stand to write this kind of checks as well. So you have to decide if you want to put it in your test or in PHP Stand. I think either is good, as long as you have something that enforces certain rules, if you like to do that. So you're not required to do this, but it's a really nice way of doing it. The options are endless with this. So I just want to quickly hit safety mechanisms. Yeah, let's just dive in. M+1 prevention. It happens a lot, especially in Laravel. It's really easy to just load a relationship without getting an error, and then suddenly you try to get a reservation with 100 messages, and then you're doing 101 queries. Damn it. Well, or in this case, we're having a reservation with a property. So if we get all the reservations, so let's say we have 3 reservations, we will also try 3 times to get the property. Even if the property ID is the same, we will still do the query because this is the M+1 problem. And we can fix that. We can fix it by using eager loading. So we can say reservation with property and then all. It will automatically do 1 query instead of 3 for the property. So it will fetch all the reservations and then fetch all the properties that are part of the reservations output already. So that's a faster way of doing those queries, and it doesn't really matter with 4 reservations or 3 reservations. But if you do 1,000, then it becomes really a thing. Then you go from 1,001 queries to 2 queries. And Laravel has a thing called model prevent lazy loading. So this enforces your application to use eager loading. And if you don't, it will throw this lazy loading violation exception. You can decide to only turn this on local, for example, and that you don't have this on production. But this is really powerful because now you have all the information when running your test, building your application. You can see what's going on, and you can prevent these kind of issues. So this is really powerful to use. So the next one is partially hydrated model protection. So in Laravel, it's possible to select certain columns and get only those values. So whenever we fetch something from the database, we hydrate a model with the columns from the database and that information. So in this case, we only select the ID and date, but we don't select the status. But if we try to get the value of status, it returns null. And if we make a typo, it returns null. But in this case, the reservation has a status in the database. But Laravel says it's null. But it's not null. We just didn't fetch it. But it's not null. It has a value in the database. So this is very dangerous. If you have an if statement, if reservation status is null, delete it. Well, yeah, we're screwed because we didn't select it, it's gone. So we can prevent that by saying prevent accessing missing attributes. So this will now throw an exception whenever you try to access an attribute that's not there. So you can protect yourself from accessing information that's not there, that otherwise should have been there. So this is a really nice way to protect yourself again. And like I said, with the if you rename a column, for example, and you forget one column, this will now throw an exception. So you never have the issue of renaming columns and then missing one. And the same goes for typos, but like renaming is a more valuable option. And then we have mass assignment protection. So if we have a reservation model, we have to tell Laravel which fields are fillable or which fields are guarded. So there are two flavors here. You can say either I want to be explicit, I want to whitelist them, or I want to be or use guarded, and then you say I want all the columns except for this one to be available. So for example, in this case, if we say we update the status and the confirmed add, what Laravel will do is it will update the status, but it will skip confirmed add. It will just completely skip it, and we don't know about it that it's skipped because it's still a successful update. That's because we have this protection in here that we can't update columns that are not fillable. So this is really powerful, but we wanted to update this one, right? But we didn't because we didn't know about this one. So there's a method on the model as well. It says prevent silent discarding attributes. So this will now throw an exception saying, hey, you tried to assign this, but we couldn't do it because it wasn't fillable or guarded. So this is really powerful. There's also a method in Laravel called model, I think it's called protect something, or model should protect or something. I didn't write it down. But it's combining all these three methods. Well, yeah, you get the idea. Use spatie packages, really helpful. Use accessors and mutators, those things are really awesome. But in the end, consistency is key. So whatever you decide to do, be consistent, and that will really help you with any project, moving to other projects. Yeah, so I don't really care how you set it up, as long as you're consistent. That's my goal today. I want you to be consistent. And the tools and safety mechanisms are just there to help you to be more consistent and to make it easier for you, because it's just one command line run away to make it easier for you. Thank you.
Great talk.
Thanks.
Very inspiring to see all this consistency being thrown at all of you. Are there any questions from the audience?
Yes. Yeah, so I'm just going to do all of them. So HTTP prevents stay requests is something you use inside your tests. So whenever you run a test, it might do an API call to an external party. So if you run this and you use the HTTP client for doing those requests, if you don't mock the client call, it will throw an exception saying, hey, you didn't mock this, but you're still trying to call an external party. So this really enforces you to mock those HTTP calls in all your tests. So you can probably put it in your base test case class to enforce it on your whole test suite. Yeah, good question.
I have a different question.
Yeah.
So did you ever, because all these standards are very nice, like when you start out with a new project, you've probably come across some projects during your career where you thought like, how in the bleep am I going to fix this bleeping?
Yeah.
Bleep. How did you approach that? Like,
well, I always try to go back then to the default. So whatever the structure is, I try to refactor back to a more Laravel-ish approach. So you can easily, so for example, if you have a lot of classes that do something about sending emails, instead of keeping those classes, I would like refactor them to notifications instead. So you have one structure to work with them. And because there are notifications now, you can also easily test them. So if you go back to the Laravel words, I guess, or a Laravel way of doing things. You can also easily write tests. For example, we have a project where we talk to an external party, but we do a lot of these events. So every time something happens, we do an event to them. But it's way easier if we make them a notification, and we can just mock the notifications in all the tests, so we don't have to do assertions on all those things in all the tests. So if we refactor that, it's much easier. It will take a lot of time, but it's definitely in the end worth it, because now we just have a notification class that we can use. And if we want to change the behavior, that's just one place we have to change it instead of all those classes.
And then was it also difficult to get the other people on your team on board? Because this is, in a way, this is what you aspire, but maybe someone else aspires something else.
So a lot of people see me as the Laravel genius or whatever.
You're wearing the shirt. Come on.
Yeah, so I just have to say I want this, and then most people listen. So that helps. But yeah, no, it's all based on arguments, right? Like, for example, with the notifications one, if you can tell them, like, okay, these notifications will help us test easier. It will help us add more notifications in the future. That really focuses on that. And yeah, you always have legacy. That's fine. Legacy is fine. It's about how you handle it. And we still have a lot of, in our code base, we have still a lot of legacy, and that's fine. Sometimes you just don't have to touch anything that just works. Like, but if we're gonna make a lot of big changes to it, we might refactor it and then go back to that structure where possible. Beers.
I think that's a very good idea. Was there anyone else with like a sitting on a question that's like, oh, I really need to.
I only see thirsty faces. Like,
yeah.
Beer.
All right. Yeah, that was a very good idea.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you again, Bobby, for your excellent presentation.
Thank you.
We have a little gift for both of you, of course.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Can I present you this first?
Thank you. Wow.
Well, you asked for it. I mean, you asked for beers. So there you have it.
Not this literally, but yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here, because you make this possible. So.
Yeah. So one more round of applause for Pim and for Bobby. And yeah, thank you for attending us here. Beers and everything, of course, in the fridge again. Feel free to stay to grab whatever you want. Chips. I think there's still some chocolate pie as well. Not sure how well it combines with the beers, but feel free. We don't have another Ode aan de Code planned yet, but of course there will be one coming in the future again. So just be sure to keep yourself posted on our meetup page, on our LinkedIn, on our whatever digital presence. And we'll hope to see you again here soon. Thank you.